Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Henry became more and more worried as the Irish drought continued, and since the rainwater butts on all four sides of his house were nearly empty by now, he decided to make contingency plans. He called in a water diviner. His idea was to try and find a source of underground water on his property and sink a borehole down to pump up the very necessary supplies he needed. The water diviner duly arrived at mid-morning the next day, and we all watched him make his unsteady way down the long driveway to the house. He was a wild-looking man with a shaggy grey beard, long tangled hair, and a weird outfit of what looked like homespun tweed, including a tattered cardigan as well as a tweed waistcoat and voluminous jacket. We were all in shorts and bare feet in the heat, but he was dressed for the Arctic. This crazy-looking old man walked over to Henry and began babbling in what sounded like some strange language, but which eventually turned out to be such a strong Southern Irish brogue that my uncle had to listen very closely and ask him to repeat his words more slowly before he could be understood. He haggled with Henry for a while over the fee he'd asked for, trying to squeeze a bit more money out of this English fool, and after things had been settled to his satisfaction, and he'd pocketed the cash, he pulled out a peeled willow Y-shaped wand from under his jacket. It looked like he'd made it with a penknife on his walk over from the village. After cutting a forked twig from a nearby willow tree, and quite likely had done just that, and with great ceremony, he proceeded to remove his heavy coat, lay it carefully down on the grass, roll up his viella sleeves, and set to work divining. He walked in lines over the lawn, both hands tightly gripping the forks of his wand, scowling with concentration and knitting his thick bushy eyebrows, which when lifted revealed startlingly bright and scheming sky blue eyes. He made his way laboriously up and down the very big, closely mown front lawn, and again he'd stop and stare at the ground, his arms outstretched, and the wand hovering over a spot. But however much it twitched and seemed alive in his gnarled old hands, he'd shake his grizzled head and carry on. We eventually got bored with this display, but not Henry, who followed him around like a shadow, watching his every move with great interest. We lay around in the heat of the midday sun on rugs and towels on the grass in front of the house and chatted idly among ourselves. This was infinitely better than one of Henry's other obsessions, which was to enlist all his house guests to rebuild the old dry stone wall at the bottom boundary of his property, behind the equally crumbling old barn that formed the bachelors' quarters. We'd all been asked to lend a hand on the second day of our holiday there, and had walked down to where Henry wanted his wall repaired. The trouble was, the entire area was waist deep in stinging nettles, something else that was new to me. And once the first one had brushed against my bare leg, making me jump and scream in agony, and which left a great red and painfully swollen wheal for several days afterwards, I decided not to go near those things again. I was used to the ideas of insects and reptiles, like snakes, potentially attacking me, but not plants. This was too much. I abandoned the project after the first sting, and was promptly joined by Francis and then gradually the rest of the group of young people, none of whom relished the job one bit, and all down tools, and we went to Murphy's bar instead. This new project was infinitely easier, and we watched on and off as the old man and Henry spent a couple of hours in the baking heat, trundling up and down the roughly 2 acres of front lawn. Finally, the old boy stopped abruptly and loudly exclaimed something unintelligible. He stood there, rooted to the spot, and we all came to look and saw the end of his wand apparently being dragged by some unseen force downwards. He looked around at us triumphantly, his crazy eyes gleaming. "Water!" he shouted. His wand continued to point downwards at the grass. He was clearly enjoying an audience and carried on holding the twig as it twitched and seemed to be pulled by a long, strong, invisible wire towards the ground. "Can I hold it?" asked Henry, intrigued. "Certainly not," snapped the old man in his thick accent. "You don't have the magic, the diviner's power to find water." He pronounced it water. Quickly he let go one end of his forked twig, reached into his capacious pocket, and pulled out a crumpled and decidedly grubby handkerchief. He dropped it on the spot where the wand was still pointing as a marker, and put the wand away out of sight somewhere about his person. Henry sent Miles back to the house to find a more suitable marker, and he came running back with Audrey's carving fork, which Henry then rammed handle deep into the selected spot, while the handkerchief was removed and used by the old man to mop his brow. His job was done. With great satisfaction, he shook all our hands and walked off, followed by admiring looks from Henry, clearly delighted with his day's success. "I'll get old Murphy to tell me you can sink a borehole for me. Let's all go down there for a drink." That night, the heavens opened, and it rained the whole night, filling the 4 barrels to overflowing. but the black wooden handle on the fork remained there in pride of place for the rest of our holiday. We continued to have one magically sunny day after another during our 3-week stay in Baltimore. And one day, Henry kindly organized for us to take a local riding school's horses out for a hack over the heather-covered hills. Mine was a hard-mouthed, recalcitrant brute, so typical of renters' horses, which had had to put up with many years of bad handling from equally bad riders. I had to prod it continuously with my bare heels for a couple of hours on the way out to get it to move out of a sluggish plod into a reluctant trot, never mind even a canter. And I had to saw frantically at its bit to get it to stop it from bolting with me on the way home. It was just like riding old Squib all over again. Julian, who was no rider himself and had been given the quietest horse of all, watched me as I tried to manhandle my wretched, muleless beast to do anything. "You're a forceful girl," he remarked admiringly. "Is this how you like to treat your men?" Sadly and inevitably, we had to leave, and I arrived back in London at the Barnbys' flat to find what my future lay ahead for me. Henry and Audrey were as hospitable as ever, but there had to be a plan. I'd run out of relations to stay with by now, and I couldn't go on living in their flat for much longer. So we sat around the kitchen table and they began to plot out my future with me. I was still in a state of depression after having dumped Gary, my previous boyfriend, in such a cruel fashion. That's a piece I'm forced to leave out, as it involves a particularly unpleasant incident with Julian, who is now a respectable magistrate in Oxford. He threatened to sue me if I ever revealed the true story of what happened between him and me in this autobiography. I really didn't particularly care what my future held for me. I felt like I'd fallen into a pit of despair and didn't have the energy to climb out of it. It hadn't sunk in how crucially my future depended on my next decision. "Grace says there's an opening for a house matron at a boys' prep school," said Henry, having been on the phone to his sister. "Apparently it's a really good placement, as it's a private feeder prep school to Stowe, being near Buckingham." I tried to look interested. "Would you like to go down there for an interview?" he asked me kindly. "Grace can set the whole thing up for you, as she knows the headmaster well." I tried to picture myself as a house mistress at the age of 18. Realistically, I didn't fit the description. A house matron conjures up images of a cozy, middle-aged lady who'd tend to the little boys' scraped knees and be generally sweet and motherly towards them. The only recollection I had was of my McCrory house matron, Mrs. van der Bra, as we called her. She'd been a bad-tempered, ugly old woman of about 50 who'd made our lives, especially mine, a misery all the 6 years I'd been there, with her carping and constant yelling at me to be more tidy, and her stripping my bed after every inspection, as my bed-making skills were never up to her standards. None of the others had been any better, and I shuddered as I remembered Miss Thompson, Another matron who resembled a small, furious bulldog in every possible way, and had stood guard like a gargoyle at the top of the main staircase to prevent any of us sneaking up it as a shortcut to the dorms. Did I want to be like them? I knew what the answer was. Can I give it a bit of thought? I asked Henry. Certainly, he said expansively, but don't take too long, as it's a prime position and will be very soon snapped up, as there are lots of candidates. I spent another night in the comfy little spare room, trying futilely to plot out my future. The next morning, we had a visitor. It was my Aunt Josephine, Dad's sister. She'd pitched up unannounced on the Barnby's doorstep, having arrived that same morning from Johannesburg via Heathrow. I'm going to stop this now. I don't want it to go on for too long. So, thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much to John Muslane, my sound engineer. And I'll say goodbye until next week. Goodbye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Muslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.